In today's episode of Decoding Confidence, I am chuffed, thrilled, delighted, all the descriptive words to introduce my very good friend, Sarah Black. Sarah Black is the founder of Aru Communications, which aims to help individuals and organizations communicate more effectively across cultures. She has more than 30 years of communications expertise and has worked in-house within agencies as well as a consultant and has lived all over the world. She is also the comms lead for Read Easy UK, a non-profit that helps adults learn to read. Sarah has built strong expertise and credibility in communications, PR, and now cultural intelligence, with decades of experience in leading teams and working across organizational cultures from tiny startups to groundbreaking grassroots peace building community groups to some of the biggest consumer brands in the world. Sarah is certified in cultural intelligence, and that is what we are talking about today. I first met Sarah in 2022 when she came along to my Inner Rebel conference, and I knew instantly that I was going to adore this woman. She just has this peace about her, and if you met Sarah in real life, you will know exactly what I mean. She is so tuned in to how cultural intelligence can help build thriving cultures. So I knew I had to bring her onto this podcast so we can talk about how CQ, as it's referenced, can impact confidence in the workplace. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Sarah and myself. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining me today to talk about cultural intelligence. And the introduction I've just done to you, I shared in there that you were one of the first people who introduced me to CQ, and I've written about it in my book as well. So I'm very grateful to you for introducing me to CQ. It's completely transformed how I coach, how I work with leaders, how I work in organizations. So thank you. I just wanted to say that to you in person because I don't think I've ever said that to you.
Oh, you have. I'm delighted to be here and thank you so much for inviting me. And it's great to collaborate with you on all things CQ.
So starting off, you've lived and worked in Ireland, Norway, Texas, England, Scotland. I don't think I've missed a country. And I can imagine that you've experienced quite a lot of cultural switching in those parts of the world. Was there a moment in that journey where you realized cultural intelligence was something that you had to actively develop rather than pick up passively?
Yes. And I think when I first moved overseas, I didn't have the language. I didn't know what cultural intelligence was. I hadn't studied it. And I suppose I came to it quite late. And one of the things I often say is I wish I'd known about it decades before, because it would have transformed my experience in those situations. I think what's really interesting is, yes, it became obvious to me that I needed to adapt and shift. And sometimes that's a really small thing. If you're public facing, which I was in some of my roles in Texas, yes, ma'am, no, sir, is part of how you adapt your language when you're in a different culture and different context. Very small thing, but it is a thing that matters to people. But as I went on to study CQ and get my qualifications, I think one of the things that might surprise people is that I actually find it incredibly valuable now living and working back in the UK in all kinds of situations. Because I think one of the misconceptions about cultural intelligence is it is for global situations or situations where a different culture may feel very obvious. So if you turn up as a girl from Belfast in Norway, it's fairly obvious fairly quickly that you're living somewhere very different. And if you go from Norway to Texas, it's even more obvious. But actually, I find it now as valuable as I would have then. And as I did kind of falling into it, as I said, my later years in Texas and then coming back to the UK. And what it gave me, and what I hear when I talk about it to other people, is that it gave me the framework and the language and the methodology for things that I was aware of, but didn't have the discipline or support to really implement properly. So it gave me all of those tools for something that I knew I needed, knew that I'd had some experience of. But I mean, I use it every day. And because it's not just about different national, regional cultures, it's about different styles of leadership. It's about different levels of confidence in the organization that you're in, different organizational cultures, even within a single entity, and different lived experiences, as well. And you'll know, because we've talked about this a lot before, that cultural intelligence isn't about changing who you are. It's about bending, not breaking. So it's that flexibility to enable other people to be more confident to do the jobs that they love or to flourish in the situation that they're in.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I use that all the time. I do accredit it to you as well, that bending, not breaking, because a lot of folks will often say to me, but I don't want to change my personality. I don't want to change, my beliefs. I don't want to do this. I feel really uncomfortable in me having to completely change my entire perspective of X, Y, Z. And I will always say it's not about changing your personality, your cultural experience, or anything like that. It's about, as clear as what you just said, it is about adapting. It's about listening properly to what people are saying, which is why I wrote about cultural intelligence in my book, Decoding Confidence, because it's a core part of confidence. I strongly believe that. CQ can help you be more confident when you're working, as you said, in a team that does have different perspectives, different lived experience, different global and regional experiences as well. When you think about, so you've spoken about your own personal experience with CQ and kind of benefited you, to someone who's listening to us right now and haven't really ever come across Q, or I've heard elements of it, but are not fully aware of how they can use it in their day-to-day life. How would you sum it up? How would you sum up CQ in a couple of sentences, just so people really, truly get it and understand what it is and why we talk about it so much?
I think when it comes right down to it, the thing that I always talk about, it's your ability to work effectively, and now I would say, having read your book, confidently across cultures and differences. And culture shows up in so many ways. Even, we've all got friends whose families' cultures are a little bit different, how they celebrate holidays, even if it's the same holiday. Can be your team culture, your interdepartmental cultures, all of those things. I often joke that I'm a comms professional married to a quality and safety engineer. It's like very different work cultures, folks. I'm all about the risk. He's all about minimizing the risk. So it shows up in very daily ways. But also, I think most of us as leaders in the workplace, managers, even just as colleagues, have had that experience where you're like, why are they not hearing what I'm saying? Why is this not landing? Why do I feel like I'm banging my head off a brick wall? And so that ability to engage effectively to help people hear what you want to communicate, to help you hear them better. To me, it's about reducing the friction as well. So knowing that you can go into a situation with people who are potentially very different from you with the tools and skills that you need for that to be effective for you is a key part of confidence. And that's what cultural intelligence, the practice of cultural intelligence, can give you.
Fantastic. And you work with teams specifically on CQ. Where does confidence come into that? Oh, and you work with leadership teams and communication teams. Are they generally more or less confident about navigating cultural differences than professionals? And I'm talking specifically about comms teams. We say, don't we, both of us are communication professionals, are responsible for making sure that our messaging is as inclusive as it possibly can be to the public that we serve, whether that's internal, external, whatever our role is. Where does that kind of confidence come into? What's your experience when you're working with teams like this?
It's very varied. I think quite often when I am talking to comms teams about cultural intelligence, there's an element of them not knowing what they don't know, right? But there is for all of us. Every day, in fact, for me. And I think a lot of the times cultural intelligence builds their confidence. So it is sometimes the confidence to say, wait, we need to think about this a bit differently. And again, sometimes it articulates what they're feeling. I get that feedback a lot by going to a speaking event, that people will come to me afterwards and say, you've just articulated something that I really felt very deeply, but didn't have language for and didn't have a framework for. So I hear that a lot. So I think comms people want to bring people together. They want to engage with those audiences. They have that kind of drive and motivation. What they don't always have are the tools to do that effectively. So I think that the drive is there, the interest is there. There's not always the confidence, but I think, to me, cultural intelligence is like the missing superpower for comms people, because it is giving us that extra skill set that I think we really need to be able to think more clearly about our audiences and say, well, what are the barriers to people hearing what I'm saying? I think the other thing, massive sweeping generalization coming now, folks. I think a lot of comms people can be quite self-aware, because you kind of have to be thinking about the impact of your own communication a lot. right? It's kind of part of who we are. And I think one of the big misconceptions about cultural intelligence is that a lot of people think it is about understanding others, and it is. But it is also first and foremost about understanding yourself. There's a lot of self-reflection in cultural intelligence. And I think one of the things that comes up when I work with comms professionals is giving them permission to do that. We're in a very fast-paced, constantly challenging industry, never more so. But actually having those moments to go, wait a minute, what am I feeling? What's showing up? What am I bringing to this conversation? What assumptions am I bringing? How do I show up here? I think is incredibly valuable. And I think people who have embraced that, I see their confidence increase enormously. And I think sometimes you have a great gift for this, is giving permission, people permission.
Yeah, it makes it was an epiphany for me, Sarah, when I came across CQ and you shared what CQ was with me, because I've been a coach for 15 years and I've worked with so many different leaders, so many different comms team organizations, and I felt from a personal lived experience that I was pretty well tuned into active listening, empathy, putting myself in other people's perspectives, that kind of stuff, like you do as a coach. As a coach, you're often quite reflective. And as a comms person, as you quite clearly articulated, that as comms folks, we are often also in tune generally with what the organization needs from us, what our leaders need from us, how we influence, how we demonstrate impact. My gap 100% was around those cultural intelligence perspectives, exactly what is going on. And quite clearly, actually, one of the things you just said there was having the framework and the tools to be able to articulate what was missing and what I needed. And the framework around CQ, especially the drive around why we do what we do, the motivators behind our approach, was a big moment for me, because I had this strategy, I took action, but what was the drivers for me? That's what I really had a gap in. I really had to think about, because I talk about it from being this South Asian woman from the north of England, my own personal lived experience. And I used to use that as an example of inclusion and exclusion and all of that kind of stuff. But I hadn't really given much thought to my motivators. Like, why important? What is driving me to pay attention to this specific community or this specific gap that I'm spotting? And I do think that's a lot of work needed in that space. I'm not saying it's easy work. A lot of folks don't often take the time to do that. So we'll always get a pushback on DE&I. Like we've seen it in the current couple of years, right? Where world leaders are talking about how DE&I is not great, it's wokeism, all those kind of stuff. But it's from my perspective, I'd love to hear your side. I do think it's driven through fear, and it's driven through, I have had it fairly easy-ish in my life, and I've kind of dominated the conversation through my own, what I good, what good should look like, or what meritocracy should be. Now it's becoming a bit uncomfortable for me because the mirror's been held up to me. And I think cultural intelligence allows us to really dig much deeper than the peripheral of what I is. What do you think in terms of what we're experiencing in current times around the narrative on this area of work?
I think it's really interesting. I think you're right about the motivation. I think it's really uncomfortable sometimes to sit with yourself and go, actually, this is about my ego. This is about my reputation. This is about me. And actually, it needs not to be about me. I need to just sit with them and unpack that for a minute and go, right, okay. And also to understand other people's motivation. I think one of the things that I say anytime that I run a session is that CQ can bring up a lot of judgment of yourself and of others sometimes. Those moments where you go, oh, I do that, right? When you're kind of confronted by your own bias or your own kind of, things that are maybe not the best of you, shall we say. And I think you're right. I think there's pushback. I think what's really interesting, I wish I could remember the name of the person who led this session in London a couple of years ago. But actually, if you look at the cycle of what we now call DEI work, it's been called a lot of things over the years, right? If you look at the cycle, there has always been pushback of various kinds and in various ways. And yes, I think part of what I've learned personally from cultural intelligence work and the practice is being able to sit in that discomfort and go, this is really uncomfortable for me, but I need to see what's motivating other people and have empathy for that and try and lean in to try and understand that rather than just reacting to it. That life is quite often not either or, but both and. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot a lot of what's coming through now is that discomfort and that holding the mirror up and this is all a bit too much. And also, I think if I include myself in part of the DEI industry, I think there are things for us to learn as well about, how did we get to the point where people were that uncomfortable with it, and what can we learn about bringing those people back to the table? And there's an argument that we don't need to and we shouldn't have to and all of those things. But I'm a bit like, it's going to take all of us. If we want things to be better, then it's going to take all of us making change. We can't, I lived in Texas for a long time. Y'all means y'all, all y'all. And so I think one of the discomforts about inclusion is that if you want, for example, to have a confident and inclusive workplace, we can't just go, well, they don't like DEI, so we're going to ignore them. That's really hard to sit with that. And for me, cultural intelligence helps me that, because if I think about the culture those people were brought up in, the world that they have evolved in, the things that they are used to, all of that informs their motivation and how they show up. Now, I'm not going to break, not going to be anything less than who I am, not going to badge in my beliefs. But how can I build those bridges? And I think that's such a hard question for our time, is how do we build those bridges? And I go back to something that's a very good friend of mine, my first ever boss, actually, the Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, who has done a huge amount of work in peace building and reconciliation, not just in Northern Ireland, but in other parts of the world, is if you wait to be able to trust people who hold vastly different views from you, you will never get into the conversation. Sometimes, and again, goes back to motivation. How much do I want to be right, or do I want to see us move on? It's like, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do that, but I think it is complicated and messy. But for me, that's where I lean in hard to the cultural intelligence work and what's motivating me and what really matters, and how far can I bend in a way that's safe for me, knowing that I hold a shed load of privilege in that context as well. So different scenario for me than perhaps for you or other people.
I think it's that you made such a valid point, and this is something I've had to learn in my own journey, because one of my biggest values is fairness, and I know that I can be a red rag to a bull when fairness is not displayed, or what I perceive as fairness. And that's really important as well, to acknowledge that fairness to me may be very different fairness to you. And that's something I've had to come to terms with, because when I did face somebody who was against the work I was doing in EDI, or felt that I was woke and I was making a big scene about something that didn't need to be made a big scene about, I did retreat from that conversation, and I did become very dismissive of their point of view. I was like, well, they're just, and I'm sure, folks, if you're listening, you may have come across this. You do assume that they're just difficult, or dare I say, idiots. You have this kind of perception that they just don't get it, and they may not get it in that way. But to your point, what are their motivators that are driving those thoughts? And that's, as soon as I change my way of handling kind of conflict, I suppose, if you want to kind of call it that, rather than seeing them as difficult, and I changed it into seeing them as being different, but also thinking about what are their motivators. I know what my drivers are and what my motivators are, but what's theirs? And when you put yourself in that position, it doesn't even, in all aspects of life, by the way, whether you are a line manager managing someone who's different from you, whether you're recruiting somebody who comes from a different lived experience to you, whatever. But when you kind of think about what are their drivers, what are their motivators, why do they think that way, it does change how you have that conversation with them, rather than you leaning into your bias and assumptions about why they think that. And that's why I love CQ. I love the fact it allows us to really step back and reflect on those drivers. And I'm going to ask you in a second, Sarah, to talk about the framework, just so folks get what that framework is and what we're referencing.
I think to me, it's one of the great benefits. It's one of the things that I think we talked about comms professionals, but I think for any leader, and specifically in relation to confidence, is it helps you dial up the empathy when sometimes you're really struggling, because, we all have people who get on our last nerve, let's be honest. Like, none of us are perfect. Even those of us who have worked on cultural intelligence, like, I am not, like they say in Texas, I'm not all that in a bag of chips. But it does give you some frameworks to go back to. But I think it helps with empathy, and I think it helps with vulnerability, because it helps you thinking about your own motivators and what pushes you can also help you think about other people's. And I've had really interesting conversations around, like, AI, for example, when, you can be a leader who's like, let's go. Actually, you might have people on your team who are terrified. And then how do you lead those people in a way that brings them on the journey? And that's quite a big shift. And I'm just using that as an example, that it can be something very practical and very tangible that maybe people are approaching with a lot of fear, or a lot of anxiety. And you can get people who are wildly enthusiastic who might need to rein back in a little bit, and have to talk about risk management perhaps a little bit. So that, ability to look at issues and think about how people respond to them and then adapt and flex so that you're getting the best and also you're leading an effective, confident team where people maybe have that psychological safety to come to you and say, I get that you're very excited about this. I get that it's important to the business, but I really am struggling with this. So would you like me to talk about the framework now?
Yes, I think it'll be really useful for folks to understand the framework so they can take bits away. And we'll also share in the show notes where you can get additional information. I know Sarah's got some great recommendations. I've read some incredible books. So we're going to share all this in the show notes. If you are curious about digging into the framework and models, and also experts and specialists in this space, we'll add some resources in the show notes for you. But yeah, if you could explain the framework of how CQ works, I think that will be very helpful.
Yeah. And I'll just preface it by saying it's research-based. It's based on decades of research, ongoing research. We're actually slightly behind, I'm going to say, in the UK. The other parts of the world are maybe embracing this a little bit more. So 4 interconnecting and I would say self-reinforcing elements to CQ. You can't just pick one and work on it. You have to work on them all, folks. So we talk about your drive or your motivation, and that's the extent to which you're sort of feeling positively about leaning into working across difference. And also, where's that motivation coming from? Okay. Quick thing I'll say about that is to think about it like your fuel gauge. If your motivation's very low, you might just be low on energy. Great chapter on that in Advaita's book coming out soon. So think about that. And also sometimes think about psychological safety. If you're not feeling motivated, that may be because you're not safe. So don't beat yourself up if your energy is low. Think about why that's happening. We then talk about I'm struggling to get them right now. Your strategy. So what's your plan? Knowledge. Can I start that again?
Yeah, start again. Yeah, absolutely.
So talk about the model now. Just to say before I start, it's based on decades of knowledge. There is a lot of research ongoing on cultural intelligence. There's really good, robust academic research behind this. So it's not just something that, David Livermore, who's written a lot about CQ, wrote in a napkin one day and caught on. So 4 elements that are mutually self-reinforcing. You do need to work on all 4. They fit together. They flow together. The good news is that you can assess these and capture a moment in time and see where you are and where you might need to do some extra work. So typically we start with drive because that is to do with your motivation. That's literally what is driving you when it comes to engaging with people who are different from you in whatever way they might be. I like to think of it as being a bit like your fuel gauge as well. So if your drive is low and you're just like, I just want to go into a place where everybody's like me and we're all the same, and you're not feeling confident about that, don't beat yourself up. Don't judge yourself. Don't be hard on yourself. Check in on your energy. Read Advaita's chapter on energy, which is a game changer in the new book. But also think about, is this maybe because I don't feel safe in this conversation or in this context? And then that's something you need to find other ways to deal with that are not your responsibility always. Knowledge, the extent to which you have information and data about people who are different from you. So if we look at that in a global context, it may be around laws, customs, practices. If you're in business, it might be, how does business get done? How do I engage with this organization? What are the social norms? What would be a massive faux pas? How do I decode what's going on? What does confidence look like in this culture? And sometimes that's more obvious in national, regional context, but I would say that actually, if you think about how a different team works, how a different individual performs at work, you can gain knowledge. We're not ever going to know everything. Knowledge is an ongoing thing. Thank God for AI, because now we have a bit more knowledge, but it's also the knowledge about what do I need to know to make this conversation successful or this context successful. So then we go to strategy, which I love. That's metacognition. And strategy is, yes, about planning. I do love a plan, but it's also about the stage at which you stop and go, I want to think about my own thinking. What am I bringing into this conversation, meeting, team leadership role? What views am I holding? How might I need to flex? How might I need to show up in this context to be effective, to be confident, to instill confidence in other people? And then finally is the action. It's the what am I actually going to do? And that's when you bend, but you don't break, is your action. I think for a lot of people thinking about developing their CQ, it's very easy for us to lean into the knowledge part because that feels comfortable, right? There's actually research that shows that's counterproductive, because then you tend to switch off that self-reflection and the planning, and you go, but I know this, I know what to do. And you aren't reading the cues in the room, perhaps, because if you've met one Southeast Asian woman from Manchester, you've met one, and we're all different. And so you you don't read all the cues of the complexity of the situation. So yeah, that's the model. And all four, we've got subdimensions, we've got all kinds of things. You can be assessed, but that's the big four areas to work through. I can't hear you.
I love the framework because it gives you such a clear pathway on where your gaps are and where your strengths are. When I did the assessment, 100% to your point, knowledge was really strong for me. Like, I am a lifelong learner. I used to call myself a certificate chaser. And the irony was I was doing my certification in CQ when I did my assessment. But when I was strong, but drive wasn't too bad, to be fair. There were drivers who were actually okay, but strategy was my weakest. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't really having that time for reflection. Like I said earlier, I was doing things I thought were right, which I think many people do. But I wasn't really giving myself that time to strategize and to really think about what it is that I'm trying to achieve in this situation. And like you said earlier, as what egos are at play, because that's what happens sometimes. When you enter a debate or a discussion, you end up kind of fighting against the egos rather than the objective that you're trying to achieve. And the strategy element really allowed me to really think, and it still does, to this day, I still have to remind myself to take a step back and to think about what plan am I putting in place to take effective action, which is why it goes in that order, right? The drivers, the knowledge that you need, and how you're going to strategize using that knowledge, and how are you going to deliver and take action. And that's why I love the kind of CQ model, because it gives you the breakdown about where your strengths are and where the opportunities of growth are as well for you.
Yeah, and I think it also, I keep going back to this idea of permission to pause and just take, 5-10 minutes before you go in to, if you're a leader listening to this, and if you're struggling with your confidence, maybe you're struggling with a team situation, it gives you like 5-10 minutes where just like quickly go around that and just check in on yourself, check in on, think about what you're going into, because so many of us run from one thing to another. And we don't give ourselves permission to take that 5 minutes to go, this will be better and more effective. We will have better outcomes and impact if I just take 5 minutes and think about this. And then that self-reflection, which can be really uncomfortable sometimes. We have to go, I did not do well there. That's not. But my role model for this is David Livermore. I'm sure his book will be in the show notes. David is the foremost author on cultural intelligence, brand new framework on leadership styles, actually, and how those are different that he's developed. And I love that nearly any time I have interviewed David or I've heard other people interviewing him, he will tell you something that he, misstepped, or he'll tell a story kind of against himself where he has not shown up in a way that would suggest he has high cultural intelligence. And I think that ability to be vulnerable and say, which is a key part of your confidence framework, and say, do you know what, that didn't have the impact that I wanted, or I didn't pay enough attention to what was happening there, or to what that person, what was going on with them, or how they might need this to be phrased, or I just didn't know, I think is really important to confident leadership, and to building confident cultures, so that we do have permission to say, I'm really sorry, I didn't know, or I will do better, and then move on and start doing better. But I think having a framework for that is incredibly helpful, because we're all trying to hold so much in our minds. And it helps you understand, obviously to your work, this is a Decoding Confidence podcast, what confidence looks like for different people and how that shows up. That, confidence can be very understated and very quiet. And we've all got, or a lot of us have, this perception of what confidence looks like. And so thinking about how that presents differently in a workplace or an organization and in individuals, I think cultural intelligence can really help you with that.
Yeah, 100%. And again, it's what you just said there before about David's book, and I've read a couple of his books now, and I love the vulnerability to show in those books, because it isn't about perfection. It's about progress, and it's about learning from failures and making sure that you adjust and adapt, as you said earlier. And what I love about what you said as well, Sarah, is that you take work seriously, but you never take yourself seriously. And I love that. And it's so important to remember that. But how does that show up? You've kind of hinted towards it just before, but how does that show up when you're working with someone who is genuinely scared and nervous about getting something wrong? Because it isn't, we say it all the time. David has said it. It is about progress, not perfection. But let's be honest, people are frightened and there's a lot of fear about getting it wrong and upsetting people and things like that. So how do you manage?
Well, I think first of all, you've got to meet the person that's there in front of you where they are. Whilst I take work seriously, but not myself seriously, I know there are times where I need to dial that down, right? To meet somebody, because some people are quite unnerved by that. And it can lead to miscommunication. So I have to really meet that, be very thoughtful and intentional about what conversation I'm having. The other thing is, I quote you. I think this came from you, but I've said it a lot recently to people, is you're either winning or learning. And if you're learning, you're winning. That is generally how, and that's work on myself. I am a recovering perfectionist. But if I'm talking to somebody who I think is struggling with their confidence, who's maybe feeling a bit anxious, you try and break that down. Where's that, what can we do to overcome that? What support do they need from me? I always take that very seriously. But it is important to remember that it is just work, right? Even if you do very important social justice work or life-saving work, that there's so much more. But also if you learn, then actually you've not lost anything. And it's our failure to learn, I think, that is probably the most tragic thing. And so saying to people all the time, okay, we've learned something here. What are we going to do about it? What's the next step? And reflecting on the learning, not the sort of fear, or what do you need to learn to build the confidence? So having that support and knowledge around you. But again, that's the cultural intelligence. And I think back to my very, very early days as a manager. And I apologize now to everybody I manage, because I know so much more now. I think I would be better at it. I hope I would be better at it. Is that not everybody needs the same things from you. And you have to have the confidence to flex, to meet the person sitting across the table or across the screen from you, and to try and understand where they're coming from and how you show up to help them develop and learn and become more confident and become more effective in the role that they're in. So yeah, no, I never take myself too seriously. But I do think the work, and particularly the work of cultural intelligence, is incredibly important. And I think that thing about not taking myself too seriously is I have to be able to say I messed up and that I didn't know, or that I'm not good at that thing, but this person sitting with me is. And for me, that's kind of where the vulnerability comes from. And also trying to keep a sense of appropriate humor. Learned a lot about that living in different cultures, that, what makes some people laugh does not make others.
Humor is definitely something that cultural intelligence can help with in terms of understanding that, because it's complex. And it's really funny because I was born and raised in the UK, but even some of the British humor still goes right over my head because I didn't have that lived experience of what some of my friends who've got generations of living in the UK have experienced. What I really love about what you just said there is about you don't have to be the same for everybody, right? Everybody needs something different from you, especially as a leader or a line manager. And this is why in the book, I've spoken about connecting CQ work with DISC work as well. And if you don't know what DISC is I don't like to call it a personality test because it isn't that. It's about understanding what your preference is in how you communicate. And everybody's got a different preference in how they want to communicate. Some people are direct, some people are indirect, some people are more reflective, some people are not as reflective, some people are steadier, some people are fast-paced. It's about recognizing and understanding the differences in how people prefer to communicate. It doesn't mean, as you said earlier, Sarah, though, you can't dial up and dial down some of this stuff. If you're a leader who's very direct and to the point and, determined and fast-paced, but you're working with a team that's more reflective, more steadier, then you can dial down that fast-paced and think about what reflection looks like. And that's where, and when you combine it with CQ and the work CQ does around the framework and the behavioral values in CQ, which I've written about in the book as well, it's so powerful as a leader because knowledge and understanding other people is what will help you have that steady, sustainable confidence in the work that you're doing. And it gives you breathing space. As you said before, that when you don't have that breathing space to be okay with making mistakes, or failing, then that's when that anxiety and anxiousness and the fear sets in, and confidence is really shaky. And when confidence is shaky outwards, inside, the doubt you're facing can be quite catastrophic on your mental and physical well-being. And that's something why I think both of us are on the same page with the passion we have around this work, because like you said, it is work. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It could be the life-saving work, or it could be whatever, but it is work. And we need to put it in context sometimes. And when you are finding it's impacting your well-being, your mental health, how you're showing up for yourself, how you're showing up for others, you do need to take that pause. You do need to have that permission to pause, as you said, and look at where the energy drivers are from. And that's why the chapter in my book about energy is probably one of the most important chapters, I would say, in my book, because you can't do any other habits around confidence if your energy isn't where it needs to be, because it's really challenging when you are tired, exhausted, mentally drained, on the verge of burnout or in burnout, to even think about empathy and vulnerability and integrity and how to be bold and all of that kind of stuff, which is why it is really important if you're listening to this and you're feeling in a space of disconnection or disengagement, or you don't know where you're going. I think that the advice from both of us on this today's pod is take some time to breathe.
Yeah, 100%. You probably had this experience as well, but when you do a CQ assessment, which you can do, Valida and I are both qualified to do those. A lot of people, high performance leaders, communicators, feel that their drive should be high all the time, right? Because we are high drive people, we are high performing people. And actually kind of want to normalize that not everybody, that's not sustainable for anybody. Like there are times, we are kind of hardwired to want things to be the same, and life is stressful and there's a lot of change all the time. We talk about this a lot. But actually kind of normalizing that sometimes you do need low drive, and you need to kind of pay attention to that. I won't say retreat, but just carve out some time. Whether that's breaks between meetings, whether that's, taking an hour off, having a holiday, getting some coaching, getting some fuel in, so that you're kind of feeding that energy, and you can go back to what motivated me to do this work, what motivated me to get involved in CQ. But I think it's so important. And I think, that chapter had a profound effect on me, and I very much hold that chapter on energy and my thinking about CQ drive together. For me personally, that's kind of my little self-check-in on, I'm not feeling it today. Why am I not feeling it? What's going on? To try and get myself back up to being in that place of really being motivated to work across difference and to work and to lean in and be able to adapt. Because adapting takes energy, it costs energy. And so thinking about where that comes back in, I think is really important.
Brilliant. And you know what, Sarah, I could talk to you for hours and hours about
and
this.
We often do, Vita.
Okay, but we've had to be very strict with ourselves on this podcast and to keep it to a time. But thank you so much for all your insight today. If people want to find out more about the work you're doing, how can they get in touch with you? Like, where's the best place for them to do that?
You can go to my website, sign up, say hello, and listen to my podcast on which Advita has appeared. But also find me on LinkedIn. It's a good time to just slide into my DMs and have a chat.
Thank you again, Sarah. And I'm going to share all of Sarah's details in the show notes as well. So if you're interested in CQ, if you're interested in having more conversations about this, then there's going to be plenty of places for you to get in touch with her. Thank you for taking the time out to listen to our conversations. And I will see you soon, Sarah, very much so. And hopefully I will see some of you next week on our podcast as well. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to this episode about cultural intelligence. I really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. If you found it useful and helpful, then please do forward it on to somebody in your network that you think will benefit. And if you listen to this podcast regularly and you enjoy the conversations, then I would love you to leave me a review either on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you prefer to leave a review. You can also DM me a review. I love to know what you think and what you'd like me to discuss in the future as well. So if you've got any ideas, or if you've got ideas of guests that can appear in future episodes, then drop me an email at advita@decodingconfidence.com, or you can DM me on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, wherever you fancy and wherever you hang about. Please also check out my new book, Decoding Confidence, The 7 Habits of Confident Leaders. If you enjoy these podcast episodes, you're certainly going to enjoy my new book. And you can purchase it from wherever you like to purchase your books. Or if you want a limited edition and a personalized edition, where I'll sign and leave you a nice little note, you can purchase it directly from my website as well, decodingconfidence.com/book. I'll leave all of these details in the show notes, including where you can find out Sarah's information as well. Take care, and I will see you next time.